Hey guys, it's Navin at No Limit Hold'em talking about how to play against specific player types. So in this series we're going to talk about your archetypical villains, your calling stations, maniacs, tags, lags, etc., etc. We're going to start off with a video on how to beat the archetypical maniac and in general what adjustments we ought to make to combat loose aggression at the tables. Poker and probably especially No Limit Hold'em, or especially games where you're playing big bet poker, pot limit Omaha, No Limit Hold'em, I guess pot limit Hold'em. These games, these especially heads-up matches, can tend to come down to stylistic matchups where player A can beat player B wins against player C, and player C beats player A as sort of a rock, paper, scissors type non-linear hierarchy. But that shouldn't be the way that it is, because the best players, they shouldn't really have a style as much as they should be making adjustments to their opponent's style or propensities or profile. So we're talking about how to beat a maniac. What do we mean by maniac? What are we looking for? How do we identify who fits into this category? And the reality is it's not so black and white. It's more of a spectrum. Players are going to have loose aggressive tendencies, more maniacal tendencies. Some players will kind of switch back and forth from being more or less straightforward to outright insanity. And it's our job to figure out what level of aggression we're seeing, what level of loose aggression we are seeing, and to make sort of Bayesian adjustments, which I don't think we'll get into Bayesian mathematics at present, but maybe we'll do that in the future. So some of the things, though, that we're talking about when we're talking about loose aggression or maniacal opponents, if we're playing against the maniac, we can expect that they're going to open very wide from the button in a heads-up sit-and-go or even a heads-up cash game. It's often going to be 100%, and very often that's going to be more than a min raise, but that's not necessarily the case. But I think if you see a player sit down and open the first 3 buttons in a row to 3 times the big blind, rather than kind of a more standard 2 times the big blind for heads-up sit-and-goes especially, there's a pretty good chance you're going to be up against a maniacal opponent. But a player that opens wide, a player that 3-bets relentlessly, if a player just 3-bets pretty often, it doesn't necessarily mean he's a maniac, because the truth is, in a heads-up game, if 2 competent opponents face each other, they ought to be 3-betting pretty often. At the micro stakes, I don't 3-bet very often, but that's because most of my opponents aren't that good, which means that there's a lot more incentive to flat call, and there's usually less incentive to 3-bet. So, but a maniac is he's going to be 3-betting more of your button opens. He's going to c-bet more, and some of your more maniacal opponents are content to continuation bet 100% of the time. Some of them are a little bit more picky. But even the maniacal opponents that don't continuation bet 100% of the time, you've got to kind of ascertain what it means when they check back. It can mean anything from they actually have the nuts this time or something like it, to they completely whiffed and they want to keep their fold equity going for future. And very often it can just mean they've got some kind of showdown value type hand if they're decent, that they don't feel needs to be bluffed with, and they don't feel can be bet for value. So a high c-bet frequency, if it's 100%, then that's pretty easy to deal with and pretty easy to adjust to. If it's 90%, you need a little bit more information to make good adjustments to the c-bets. I mean, the way that you would react to a player that's c-betting everything but the nuts, and the way that you would react to a player that is c-betting everything except for bluff catchers, or the way that you adjust to somebody who's c-betting everything except when he has like nothing, like no high card value, no pair, no overcards, no backdoor draws. Those 3 adjustments are going to be very, very different from one another. Most of your maniacs are going to barrel turns very often, And in order to qualify as a true maniac in my book, this villain's going to have to c-bet a high percent, barrel a high percent on the turn, and 3-barrel pretty often. They're also not going to want to fold to our aggression, so they're going to probably call more often. They may re-raise us more often, but they will almost certainly fold less often. And they might be check raising our c-bets, floating us out of position, floating us in position if we 3-bet pre-flop. And we don't really know how the Maniac is going to react to our 3-bets until we get in there and start kind of playing around, because some players that are very maniacal, and this is for heads up, or it can go for full ring or anything in between, some Maniacs or very loose, very aggressive players, since they're opening so many hands, they will fold very often to a 3-bet because their range is just going to be pretty weak. But then other Maniacs are going to have more of a GTO type approach, and they're going to maybe take the top and bottom of the range and 4-bet it, and then flat some stuff. Then other Maniacs are going to be really bad to 3-bet against with anything but like the virtual nuts, because, well, I should say anything that you're not willing to stack off with, because you will run into players in heads-up sit-and-goes, 6-max games, well, especially online, though, at full ring, well, I guess, yeah, full ring, you will run into guys that are so maniacal pre-flop that if you 3-bet them, it's a virtual certainty that they're going to 4-bet you. Against tight, aggressive, reggy-type players, you could do a lot worse than to 4-bet 100% of their 3-bets, and some of these players have figured that out. I mean, you can do better than that, too. That's why I don't think we ought to be Maniacs, but these are the kinds of things that we're talking about. And this is where the video should start to open your mind a little bit and hopefully get some light bulbs to go off. So what is the primary adjustment that we make against the archetypical Maniac? The number one adjustment, and this is as true as a fact can possibly be in poker, the number one adjustment is to call more often and to bet and raise less often than normal. If you're one of these people that preaches or thinks that the correct adjustment is to start 3-betting wider, to open like a light 4-bet range and a bluff range, and to kind of get into this mode where you're fighting fire with fire to, quote, not seem weak, or, quote, not let your opponent run you over, you're missing out on some opportunities for very easy profit. The number one adjustment, again, is simply to raise less often and call more often. So you want to bet less often, raise more often, call more often, do less folding, but do less raising. And that is the way to really hurt a player who's maniacal or very loose and aggressive. And there's two things that this does. Let's go post flop and think about it. If you've got something like top pair with a bad kicker, and your opponent has been just c-betting every flop and barreling every turn, maybe you decide to flat him pre-flop with like ace-5 suited, and the flop comes out like ace rag, like ace XX rainbow. If you check and he bets, you might be tempted to think something like, well, he can't always have it, so I'm going to raise him here. And you're right, he can't always have it, but you're wrong about the so I'm going to raise him here. By just checking and calling with a hand like top pair with a bad kicker, you beat him in two ways. Number one, it saves you money when he actually does have a big hand. And every once in a while you're going to run into it, and you want to cut your losses when you do run into it. Number two, it's going to encourage your opponent to continue betting as a bluff, and many players that are decent lags or good thinking lags understand that their range looks pretty weak, and that means that they're going to value bet lighter. And so you can not only encourage your opponent to bluff more often by getting into this mode where you're checking and calling more, but you can also encourage your opponent or allow him to kind of value own himself when he's thinking like, you know, my range is so wide here and I'm going to be bluffing at such a high frequency that I need to bet at least two streets with like, I don't know, second pair. And so you get the extra value that comes from checking and calling against these guys that you may well have lost had you decided to raise, causing him to correctly fold the second best hand, or causing him to correctly give up on his attempts to bluff. So if you can make an adjustment that's not only going to save you money when you're behind, but add money to the pots that you win when you're ahead, that's obviously going to be the best adjustment. And that adjustment is, again, call more, raise less. Okay, so what about 4-betting? What adjustments should we make to our 4-bet game against an opponent who's 3-betting a lot? So if we're playing against a Maniac and it seems like every time we open raise he's 3-betting, like if he's 3-betting something more than, well, if he's 3-betting something like, say, 40%, 50%, that's obviously way higher than what would be GTO. So what do we do about that with regards to our 4-betting ranges? It's important here to say and understand that not all Maniacs are created equally. I mean, just because we know that our opponent is going to 3-bet often, it doesn't really tell us what he's going to do against our 4-bets. So I would suggest, initially, if you're going to try to combat your opponent's relentless 3-betting with an adjustment to your 4-bet range, then the adjustment would be, first of all, to open a little bit, well, if you're doing anything but min-raising, you're going to probably want to start opening with a min-raise to take some of the sting out of your opponent's 3-bets when you do have to fold, and to give you more room to 4-bet and fold. So that will allow you to open up a bluff 4-bet range. So that would be my first reaction, if we don't really know what our opponent's doing against our 4-bets, would be to really polarize our 4-bet range, because what we don't want to do is from the button open raise, get 3-bet, and then take a perfectly good hand that we could flat call with profitably, that has a lot of potential to hit a flop and win a big pot against the guy, and essentially turn it into a bluff. Or take a hand like, I don't know, King 10 suited comes to mind, heads up. Like when we open and he 3-bets, we don't want to look at this hand and say, well, he's 3-betting all the time. King 10 suited is way ahead of his range. It may be. But that isn't going to help you much when you re-raise with your King 10 suited and he ships it in your face and you have to fold, or make a really uncomfortable call, I guess, depending on stack sizes. So, number one adjustment, if we're going to start engaging in this pre-flop leveling war, would be to really polarize your 4-bet range. You don't want to have a linear, depolarized range against a player that's very often going to be coming back over the top. I mean, just in general, the more often your opponent folds to your re-raises, and the less often he calls your re-raises, the more often he re-raises you, regardless of whether it's a 4-bet, 5-bet, 3-bet. The more often you're getting either raised or you're creating a fold, the more polarized your range ought to be. The more often you're getting called, the less often your opponent folds, and the less often he pops you back, the more depolarized, linear, or merged your range ought to be. Now, you may find out, depending on how your opponent responds, mostly depending on how often he calls you, when you do decide to come over the top of his 3-bets, it can be a good idea against some players to start depolarizing your 4-bet range. But if you're in a situation where you feel like you might want to depolarize your 4-betting range, you might be kind of taking a chance of getting into a game that you're not comfortable with, but your opponent is very comfortable with, and it's usually a game that can be avoided. If we're going to think like of taking a hand like King 10 suited or Queen Jack suited, heads up, of course, and 4-bet and then stack it off, probably we can just flat call the 3-bet instead, decrease variance, and go to the flop with a pretty good hand, probably range advantage, in position, playing a game that we're more probably prepared to play. So my advice would be, if you're going to open up a 4-bet bluffing range against a frequent 3-better, which is not a bad idea, then you want to make sure that you're not raising that big to begin with. Like if you go 3x as an open, you're going to have a hard time, especially heads up sit and go where you're only starting with 75 big blinds. You're going to have a pretty hard time 3xing to open and then 4-betting and then folding to a jam. So if you're going to start playing this game, make sure you're opening with min raises, and start out by polarizing your 4-bet range, using just hands that you're very happy to throw away if you get popped, that you're really just bluffing with, or hands that you are happy to stack off. Maybe against a real Maniac that's 3-betting like 50, 60, 70% against you, maybe that looks something like ace jack plus, pocket eights plus, and then whatever number of bluffs that seem, depending on stack sizes and whatnot, seems good. And just be happy to take the value part of your polarized 4-bet range and stack it, and be happy to just take the bluff portion of your 4-bet range and pitch it against the 5-bet shove. So our generic approach to line creation against any opponent, known or unknown, is always going to be to just take our own relative hand value. And when I say relative hand value, what's it relative to? It's relative to your perceived range, and it's relative to the board. It's like wherever you're at in your range with regard to what the flop texture is on the flop, that's what determines your relative hand value. If you're at the very top of your range, then your relative hand value is another value. If you're more towards the bottom, then it's bluff. If you're somewhere in the middle, then your relative hand value is something like showdown value. We take relative hand value, whatever we think the mistake potential is on a board, based on our range, our opponent's range, our actual holding, and the flop. There's going to be usually a pretty easy line, if you think about all of this in the correct way, that's going to do the best job of putting the number of bets that we want into the pot in the way we want them to go. So we also look at flop texture, and when I talk about flop texture, I do mean wet or dry, but I also mean volatile and static. I'm not going to get too much into all of that. I did a video on line creation. Maybe go back and look at that if you're not sure what I mean by volatile, static, and how it's not exactly the same as wet or dry. But usually we just frame our hands out this way, based on our relative hand value and whatever potential mistakes we expect from our opponent. We're either going to have a bluff, showdown value, a draw, some kind of value or nutted value, and we just want to think, do I want to play a big pot or a small pot, and what's the best way to get the number of bets into this pot that I want into this pot, based on all of those factors, and also my opponent's kind of mistake propensity, or his tendencies or characteristics as a player, his style, if you will. But when we already know that our opponent is a maniacal player, then there's certain mistakes we expect him to make more often than other mistakes, kind of automatically. So we have to weigh that when we look at the board. You can look at a flop and say, well, I've got, this hand on this board. There's no way my opponent can make a mistake unless I do this, or my opponent has plenty of second-best hands that I can get value from. Should I bet? So I'm just going to bet. Well, when our opponent is going to be making more betting and raising mistakes, then sometimes we would take the same exact relative hand value on the same exact flop texture, and where it looks like the mistake potential should be exactly the same, but we, instead of betting for thinner value, we can check, hoping to induce a bluff, and then call the bluff. So when we know our opponent's going to be maniacal, what we don't want to do is we don't want to do all of the things we would do against a player that's not maniacal. And the big adjustments that we want to make, again, we don't want to bet, get raised, and have to fold a hand that doesn't want to fold. And we don't want to let our opponent off the hook if we know that he's likely to bluff if we check. So the adjustments that we're going to make to the lines that we take, more or less we're going to shift all the hands we have towards the center of this kind of chart, where, again, we have showdown value, bluff, draw, we've got nutted value, strict bluff catchers. We have kind of this spectrum of potential holdings in the dead center, which is essentially going to be the middle of our range, the dead center of our relative hand value based on our perceived range and how it interacts with the board, we're going to shift everything more towards that conceptually. So we're going to kind of pretend, in a way, that our kind of weak bluff catcher hands are more robust showdown value hands. We're also going to kind of pretend or play as if our thin value betting hands are also shifted more towards the center, more towards showdown value, bluff catcher type hands. That's the adjustment. We don't, and there's a few reasons we do this. Number one, we don't want to get blown off the best hand or have to surrender equity to a raise that we would not have to surrender to a check call. Number two, we do want to induce bluffs and betting mistakes. And number three, we don't want to create a cooler. And this is the number one, I really should have said this is number one, because this is the number one problem that I think most poker players have when it comes to playing against maniacs, is they flop a very good hand, and they think, well, my opponent's always betting and raising and re-raising, so I'm just going to raise and get this in. And they just, maybe flop top pair, top kicker, and bet, get raised, ship it, and complain about getting cooler when their opponent had two pair on a board like, I don't know, ace, king, jack. And, maybe like you have ace, king on a board like ace, jack, 10, something like that. We don't want to just bet, get raised, move all in, get called, lose, have top pair, top kicker, and write it off as a cooler, when, number one, in that exact hand, you may have been able to not get stacked by checking and calling, but even more than that, because it's real easy to look at a scenario like that and say, well, based on stack sizes and the stack to pot ratio, all of that, there's really no way I wasn't going to lose all of my chips in this hand, and that may be true. It may not be true. But you also have to look at all the times your opponent doesn't have two pair, or your opponent doesn't have a big hand. And usually the best way to get value from a maniac is not going to be to take your top pair, top kicker and just sort of shove it in his face. It's going to be to take more like pot control lines. Again, we're going to be betting and raising less often. We're going to be calling more often. So that means not only are we going to be calling more often with weaker hands and getting a little stickier, but it also means we're going to be calling more often with value hands that generally would make good raising hands. So the do's and do nots, hopefully you're starting to get this. Do not attempt to beat a maniac at his own game. Don't just step up your aggression and say, I'm fighting fire with fire, and, well, damn, I guess I got coolered again. Do not wait for the nuts to trap him. I mean, that's definitely part of it. It's nice to flop the nuts against a maniac and trap him. But it's not the only thing you're doing. You're not just going to sit there and wait and fold perfectly good bluff catchers and fold perfectly good draws until your, slam dunk comes. Do not 3-bet more liberally for value. That's not the best initial adjustment. We talked about how it's possible that can end up being a good adjustment, but very likely, if that ends up being a good adjustment, you could have just as easily flat called pre-flop more liberally rather than 3-betting for thinner value and then having to either 5-bet stack a hand that you're not real comfortable stacking or relinquish a bunch of equity. So usually we don't want to 3-bet liberally for value against a maniac because we want to, again, raise less often and call more often. We do not want to raise mediocre hands post-flop either, generally speaking. What we do want to do, we do want to get sticky pre-flop with hands that have good potential. Hands, if we're deep enough, that are like pocket pairs that we can set mine. We can usually set mine more liberally against a maniac because we can expect that player to do our betting for us post-flop when he doesn't have a hand, and virtually never get away when he does have a hand. We do want to adjust our 3-bet range, but generally we want to adjust our 3-bet range and make it more polarized rather than depolarized, even when we're out of position, because maniacs may be less likely to flat call, more likely to be playing either 4-bet or fold game against our 3-bets. The more 4-bet or fold our opponent is playing, the more polarized our 3-betting range ought to be. And we do want to get sticky with mediocre hands pre-flop. Depending on how aggressive our opponent is, it's not at all unlikely that the correct move, or the correct line against a player might be to take a hand like, I don't know, King Jack, flat call instead of 3-bet it pre-flop. Flop, top pair, second kicker on a wet board, check and call, have an ace hit the turn, and it still be the correct play to call down. So do get sticky post-flop. Do adjust your 3-bet range to more polarized. Do get sticky pre-flop with hands that have good potential. Do not attempt to beat them at their own game. Don't just wait for the nuts. Don't 3-bet more liberally for value. And do not raise mediocre hands post-flop. So basically, if Villain's going to be betting and raising more often, then we want to bluff catch more often. It makes sense, right? If he's going to be bluffing more, we need to be bluff catching more. Just in general terms, we do want to avoid making plays that will allow any player to play perfectly against us. And for some reason, this is kind of going back to that thing that players tend to do the most wrong, I think, against Maniacs, is we know that we don't want to make raises, especially raises. We know that we don't want to make raises against players that are going to allow them to play perfectly against us, but it seems that this can tend to slip our minds when we're playing against a Maniac. It's kind of like that's the reward that he gets for playing this maniacal style. It's why very loose and aggressive, even reckless players can make like really deep runs in the main event, for instance, because the pots they win when they actually do have a hand tend to be bigger than they ought to be because players don't adjust for them properly. The right way to beat a Maniac is to starve him, keep the pots small, pot control, check call, bluff catch, don't get crazy until you've got a hand that's super strong and the river comes, If we 3-bet more liberally, we may have to stack off lighter than we want to. So that is, kind of a piece of advice that's going to go both ways. Number one, it's a reason that we might not want to have a depolarized 3-bet range and then just get it in against a 4-bet with like the top X% of our range, but it's also a reason that maybe we don't want to 3-bet more liberally in the first place. So that's kind of a tricky one because depending on your opponent's exact propensities, it can be correct to 3-bet more liberally and then to stack off wider than normal, but even against those players, it's usually not that correct. Knowing a player is inclined to aggression does not, in and of itself, tell us we should 3-bet more liberally. Usually, we ought to create a more polarized 3- and 4-bet range versus these players. Bottom line, this is the note I'm going to end on: call more often and raise less often. So until next time, guys, hope you enjoyed the video. If you like this kind of video, let me know and I'll make more of them. If you have a suggestion for the player type you'd like to see next, let me know what it is in the comment section or send me an email. Until next time, good quote, LUCK, exclamation point, end quote.